Four sisters' lives would be forever altered by a seemingly ordinary tragedy that occurred in the fall of 1857, when magnolia leaves began to fall over the marshy coastal plains of South Carolina. After their parents died in a carriage accident, they were placed under the care of a grandfather who was regarded as respectable and devout by society. Walter Higgins, a well-known Methodist and retired veterinarian, welcomed the orphans into his rice plantation and offered them paternal care and protection. His Christian charity was praised by his neighbors. His family's devotion was commended by the local pastor. He was viewed by the Charleston community as a model of Southern virtue during adversity. Something quite different, however, was starting to take shape behind the colonial house's white walls. Walter himself would quietly nurture this obsession for years, waiting for the ideal moment to blossom. This is the tale of a man who turned knowledge into something hideous, of how power turned into slavery, and of how four women learned that the worst predators sit at the head of the dinner table rather than hiding in the shadows of swamps. Only the whispers of the women who survived to tell it remain of a story that the Civil War all but destroyed. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments section before we go any further. Additionally, if this is your first visit to Legacy of Fear, please subscribe to the channel to see more tales that test our perceptions of human nature. The carriage was discovered 3 days following the accident, partially immersed in the Savannah River's murky waters. The wooden bridge had become a deadly trap due to the March storm. Despite their recovery, Thomas and Catherine Higgins were already bloated and deformed. None of their daughters thought that would be the last time they left. Beatrice was the first to hear the news. She was already familiar with the anguish of loss at the age of 25. Her husband had died of tuberculosis, ending their brief marriage. However, losing both parents at the same time caused a different kind of destruction. She gathered her sisters and broke the news in a voice that was hardly steady. Margaret broke down in tears. Louisa fell silent in disbelief. The youngest, Abigail, hurried to her room and secured the door. The property had to be sold because of Thomas's outstanding debts. There were no resources left for the orphans. At that point, Walter made his offer. The law automatically placed those who had not yet attained full majority under his guardianship because he was their only surviving relative. However, he extended all four are invited. His land by the Ashley River would be open to them. He had plenty of room and money, and he saw it as his sacred responsibility to take care of his son's family. The gesture was well received by the local community. The women of the church commended his generosity. Businessmen respected his sense of accountability. In his sermon, Pastor Edmund Kirby cited Walter as an illustration of Christian altruism. Nobody asked. Beatrice paused. The elderly man's eyes had a quality that deeply unnerved her, but there were no other options. She was unable to support herself and her 3 sisters without resources. It appeared more likely that they would all wind up apart as governesses or teachers. The 4 sisters arrived at the site of their future prison in May of 1857. Surrounded by rice fields that stretched to the swamps, the colonial house rose. Complete geographical seclusion. They were met with measured smiles from Walter. He introduced Imelda, the house, and showed them each room. Slave. He set up routines and communicated his expectations, decency, and complete obedience. Everything appeared to be suitable. The initial weeks appeared typical. Walter was aloof but polite, only showing up at dinners to inquire about their well-being. However, Alda saw things that the sisters were blind to. The methodical accuracy with which he assessed the young ladies, how he watched their bodies while they ate, how he inquired about feminine cycles in seemingly innocent ways, and physical constitutions. The first person to mention feeling like she was being watched all the time was Margaret. The feeling that someone had been in her room would wake her up in the middle of the night. Tiny items were moved. The doors she locked seemed to be unlocked. Beatrice attempted to comfort her by blaming everything on the strain of grieving. Always self-reliant, Louisa started to feel constrained by the limitations. Walter insisted that she stay near the house, even though she was used to riding freely. When asked, he expressed worries about his safety. The swamps posed a threat. Reports of escaped slaves surfaced. Just a young woman would be taking needless risks. Louisa was incensed, but the explanation made sense. The Bible was a source of comfort for Abigail, who was always quiet and devout. She read passages about suffering for hours. Observing her devotion, Walter started giving personal sermons at meals, quoting scripture about women's place in divine order, obedience, and sacrifice. In June, Walter declared that social visits would be prohibited for a period of 18 months. They were not the right kind of mourning. The family's reputation was further damaged by rumors regarding Thomas's debts. It was better to stay out of the spotlight. No one responded to the letters. Walter caught them in the act. Additionally, he disapproved of the pastor's visits, saying that his presence on the property was enough to provide spiritual leadership. Each sister started to be affected differently by the total seclusion. Beatrice became watchful, spotting trends in Walter's, altering conduct, trying to defend himself by predicting his next move. Margaret experienced chronic anxiety, which prevented her from ever relaxing and kept her body alert. Louisa was filled with uncontrollable rage that burned with resentment. Abigail became even more religious, reciting fragmented prayers in the early mornings in an attempt to obtain divine protection that never materialized. Walter started posing more intrusive queries in July. He asked Beatrice a question during a meal. Regarding her female health, including medical information that far outweighed any proper concern, he took on a severity she had never heard before when she hesitated. He reminded her that he was her legal guardian, and that it was his duty and right to be aware of every facet of her welfare. There was no denying the authority in his voice. Days later, Margaret was questioned in a similar manner. She blushed in embarrassment as she replied, but she complied. Louise responded more adamantly. She declined to respond, saying the questions were improper. At that point, Walter didn't argue. He merely told her that there would be repercussions for disobedience. Until she learned how to properly address her guardian, she would be kept in her room. During the 3 days of confinement, they were locked away and fed very little. Water, bread, and sometimes cheese. Louisa was pale and shaky when she was finally set free. Without hesitation, she responded to all of Walter's inquiries. The rebellion that she had sustained had been purposefully put out. Her body would never again be free to procreate, even though she was unaware of this at the time. Even if Walter forced her to become pregnant, the trauma of confinement combined with systematic fear would prevent conception. She would be deceived by her own body, which would not bear the child Walter had intended. Silently observing, Abigail responded to each question when it was her turn, her eyes fixed on the ground and her voice hardly audible. She had learned complete submission to male authorities from her religious beliefs. She appeared to be defying her grandfather by God's order. Walter started rearranging the slaves' work schedules in August. He assigned specific men to specific tasks. The informal overseer, John, took notice of the changes with concern. The pattern brought to mind preparations he had previously seen. The nieces observed that certain male slaves were present in the house unusually frequently when masters chose slaves for forced reproduction. John, one of them, appeared especially uneasy. Imelda, who had been employed at the residence for more than 20 years, identified indicators that the young ladies were unable to decipher. Although she had observed similar preparations on nearby plantations, She had never seen white women from the family itself participate in such preparations. More noticeable changes arrived in September. Walter gave the order for the niece's bedroom doors to have new locks installed. He clarified that it was a security measure. Growing instability, unrest rumors, and the need to shield young, vulnerable women were all present. But the locks could only be locked externally. Meals became increasingly tense occasions. Walter delivered lengthy talks on sacrifice, obedience, and women's roles in serving larger goals. He quoted misrepresented passages about biblical concubines and the daughters of Lot. Walter traveled to Charleston in October without giving a reason. He carried a small leather case that he kept locked in his office when he got back. The nieces were unaware that it included blank documents that Thaddeus had provided. A dishonest clerk named Gormley fabricated birth certificates that were just waiting to be completed. Beatrice spent a lot of time exploring the property while he was away. The main road was a long way off, she found, and it crossed dangerous swamps. They had no access to any horses. All of the slaves were as rigidly controlled as their masters. Without careful planning and resources they lacked, escape would be all but impossible. Margaret started experiencing nightmares on a regular basis. She awoke screaming and experienced anxiety, habit of washing her hands a lot. With the same look he used to assess ailing horses, Walter watched her decline. Louisa once tried to use a traveling merchant to deliver a covert letter. Walter caught it. The penalty was in effect for a week. Confinement and being shackled to the bed for portions of the day in an effort to subdue her defiant will. Alda had to observe the deterioration and bring only the barest necessities. Louisa had lost weight and had a vacant expression when she was eventually let go. Abigail dug deeper into religion in response to fear. She spent hours in prayer, pleading with God to keep her family safe or to provide purpose to the pain. Observing her devotion, Walter started using it in his manipulations, claiming that complete obedience was the way to salvation and that suffering was a divine test. Walter called a formal meeting of the four nieces in the dining room in November. Tension pervaded the air. Having to serve, Imelda listened to every word with a knotted stomach. The elderly veterinarian. He described his niece's purpose in the same tone that he used to talk about horse breeding. Slave markets offered him a profitable opportunity. European-looking babies were extremely expensive. The genetic material would come from his nieces. The remainder would be supplied by chosen slaves. False documentation would guarantee the children's legal sale. Beatrice found a way to shout that they would never agree and that he was a monster. Walter just grinned. He reminded her that they were alone, without trustworthy witnesses, and totally reliant on him. Who would trust them? Walter locked each of the four nieces in their rooms as the meeting came to an end. They heard the activation of the bolts. They heard the retreating sound of his footsteps. Then, in the ensuing quiet, they could hear each other sobbing through the walls dividing them. Imelda should have gone to the quarters, but she stayed in the kitchen for a long time. Her hands shuddered as she recalled her own. 3 kids who had previously been sold away. For the first time in 20 years of enslavement, she gave herself permission to think about resistance because she was aware of the agony these young women would endure. Beatrice examined the window that overlooked the dark swamps and spent hours testing the lock on her room during the first days following the revelation, which passed in a state of collective shock. Margaret refused to eat and stayed in bed. Louisa alternated between crippling despair and helpless rage. Gail continued to pray until her voice grew raspy. Walter gave them 3 days to adjust emotionally, not out of sympathy, but out of practicality. He required their physical well-being. He started carrying out the carefully thought-out plan on the 4th day. The newly refurbished slave cabins were special rooms for what he called reproduction sessions rather than upgrades. It was John who was called first. He was led to the office by Walter, who brutally explained the situation. The overseer who was enslaved would play a crucial part in the plan or be sold to Florida's turpentine camps, where the average lifespan was only 6 months. Participation or a slow, agonizing death was the option. John's face was instantly filled with fear. He had grown to respect the Higgins daughters because he believed they were human beings deserving of compassion. This was his tacit protest against dehumanization. Walter now insisted that he be used as a tool for systematic abuse. John's body refused to cooperate as he felt sick. Respond appropriately when Walter anticipated confirmation, but he had a clear understanding of the alternative. A similar summons was sent to 2 other slaves. In response, Kendall the blacksmith remained silent, which over time turned into a sickly resignation. Lighter-skinned domestic worker Joseph sobbed in public. Decades of experience breeding racing horses served as the basis for the selection. Walter used his knowledge of veterinary medicine. The most expensive combinations would result in offspring with a European appearance. First would be Beatrice. Using the coerced responses she had given him months earlier, he had computed her cycles. He told her to follow him after unlocking her door one chilly December evening. He just dragged her down the hallway when she refused. The cabin was small and dimly lit. John was already there, clearly in agony, his face twisted in a way that suggested life was coming to an end. Walter set up a chair outside and sat down with his pipe, indicating that he would stay there all night. What? Something essential to both of them was destroyed by what transpired in that cabin. Hours later, John came out looking like a man who had just died inside. His body was contorted into a defensive shape that would never fully straighten again, and his shoulders remained hunched. Stunned and unable to look up from the floor, Beatrice was led back. Through the thin walls, the other sisters could hear everything. There was no question about the sounds carried by the night silence. Margaret kept throwing up. Louisa put her hands over her ears. Gail's voice grew louder and more desperate as she prayed. Walter used his fertility calculations to establish a revolving schedule. Over the ensuing weeks, Beatrice endured numerous sessions. Margaret was then hauled to Kendall's designated cabins. Each event was made even more painful by her weakened constitution. Her bruises took weeks to heal. She wore long sleeves in an attempt to conceal mark. When it was Louisa's turn, she fiercely resisted. She succeeded in scratching Walter's face thoroughly before he overwhelmed her, leaving behind red marks that he would hide from the neighbors. He led her in chains to the cabin. She was physically restrained while Joseph was made to participate. His helplessness was over. Any remaining spirit of resistance was crushed by the extra humiliation. After being brought back, she merely curled into a fetal position and remained motionless for 2 days. The youngest was Gail. Despite her more fragile constitution, Walter felt she was ready in January. Given her smaller stature, she might be larger, and more robust infants for the market. There was a sense of death in the house during these first dreadful months. Meals were quiet affairs. Like ghosts, the nieces roamed the grounds, their clothing sagging on bodies that had shrunk from self-inflicted starvation. The oppressive weight was felt even by the slaves who labored in the fields. Alda turned into a silent observer of every humiliation. She brought food to women who could hardly swallow, cleaned the rooms after the horrible nights, and washed the dirty clothes. Her recollections of having the loss of her own children years ago took on a new level of suffering. However, her spirit and comprehension started to grow as a result of closely observing Walter's actions. He was routine, habit, and pattern. It is possible to take advantage of habits. Working from before dawn until after nightfall, John stayed away from all women in an effort to physically exhaust himself and clear his head. Kendall's hands began to shake in a way that would never go away. Joseph refused to communicate and stayed in the cabin, sleeping whenever he could, with anybody. Margaret announced her pregnancy in March of 1858. To examine her, Dr. Merrick was called in from Charleston and paid handsomely. The doctor asked evasive questions and got evasive answers about an unfortunate morning romance. He chose the comfortable blindness that came with having more money, so he didn't press. Other confirmations came in the weeks that followed. Beatrice was expecting a child. Although it took longer, Gail finally displayed the symptoms. Walter was chilly when he got each piece of news. Satisfaction, figuring out commercial values and delivery dates. In order to complete the arrangements for forged documents, he traveled to Charleston to speak with Thaddeus Gormley. A new level of fear was introduced by pregnancy. They sensed their own life expanding, the consequence of transgressions their brains could hardly comprehend. Every time Margaret felt the baby move, she had panic attacks. Beatrice made an effort to maintain her dissociation, acting as though everything had happened to someone else. Paradoxically, Gail formed a maternal bond with Thee. Speaking softly to the baby inside of her, the only happiness she could find in the shadows. Walter provided veterinary care while keeping an eye on the pregnancies. He promised sufficient nutrition to ensure healthy babies. Not out of concern, he made them do certain exercises. He gave out herbal tonics. Dr. Merrick's visits were spaced out. He never saw every pregnant woman at once. Walter claimed that individual attention was necessary for pregnancies at different times, so he planned his schedule carefully. This avoided Merrick from seeing the entire pattern that would have compelled him to take action. During the night, the slaves whispered to each other. They were partially aware of the truth and filled in the blanks with remarkably accurate guesses, but they also understood that in order to survive, atrocities had to be accepted without response. When Walter wasn't watching, Alda started spending more time with the nieces. Her human presence was the only solace she could provide. Beatrice started to realize that Alda had a deeper understanding of her suffering than any free woman ever could. Within, the first tragedy happened in April. In the 5th month of her pregnancy, Margaret started to bleed because she was so fragile. Hours were spent by Dr. Merrick attempting to save the mother and child. Margaret was stabilized by him, but the baby was born too soon. The tiny body was only alive for a few minutes. The loss of the investment infuriated Walter. Margaret was accused by him of purposefully ruining the pregnancy. He imprisoned her for 2 weeks with meager rations as punishment. She was so much lighter when she was released that her clothing, on a body reduced to sharp angles, it hung loose. The other pregnant sisters were frightened by the miscarriage. They could have lost their child just as Margaret had. Any loss would be viewed as intentional sabotage, knowing Walter. Beatrice was the first to give birth in August of 1858. Many hours were spent in labor. Dr. Merrick and Imelda helped while Walter waited outside smoking non-stop. His anxiety was only evident in the quantity of pipe draws he took. The baby's first appearance was a girl with dark hair and pale skin. The house was filled with tears. Beatrice would hear that innocent scream in her nightmares for the rest of her life. That particular sound, touched by unseen hands during her restless nights, would become inextricably linked to her trauma. However, Walter tore her out of Alda's arms before she could even see the child's face. Beatrice was ruined by what transpired in the minutes that followed, not by the infractions. She pleaded for a brief moment to hold her infant. Walter sternly declined, stating that maternal. The family could not afford the luxury of attachment. Molly, who had just lost her own child, was assigned to nurse the infant after she was brought to the slave quarters. Beatrice remained catatonic for the next few days. Imelda made an effort to get her to eat, drink, and see the outside world. However, the young lady had withdrawn to a place deep within herself where she was less susceptible to pain. She continued to see things that no one else could, but her eyes remained empty. Her thoughts were generating a space filled with only suffering that was untouchable. In October, Gail was the last to give birth. The labor was agonizing because of her smaller frame. After 22 hours, the child arrived at last. A girl so tiny that Imelda thought she wouldn't make it. After examining her, Dr. Merrick concluded that, despite her fragility, she had a chance if given the right care. Gail offered to comply with Walter's demands and pleaded for the child to be kept. For a moment, Walter thought about letting her nurse. It might increase the likelihood of survival. He determined the danger of maternal attachment was excessively high. Another slave received the infant. When her daughter was taken away, Gail completely collapsed psychologically and started experiencing hallucinations that would last the rest of her life. For several weeks, the infant stayed on the property. In the distance, the mothers could hear them sobbing during this period. As Margaret continued to heal from her miscarriage, hearing about her sister's baby served as a continual reminder of what she had lost. Walter traveled to Charleston for the first time in November, with goods made by humans. Beatrice's 4-month-old infant, whose brief existence had been turned into a commodity, was taken by him. In search of a future lady's companion, he negotiated the sale to a wealthy New Orleans family through discreet middlemen who asked few questions. The cost was high, higher than he had anticipated. Due to her precarious health, Gail's infant stayed on the property until January, before being sold for less to a Charleston family who agreed to take on the risk of the fragile child. Walter was pleased with the outcome. He had demonstrated the feasibility of the plan and produced a sizable income. More significantly, he had learned the vital role that Gurmley's forged documents played. The legal trail did not trace back to him because each birth certificate named a slave woman as the mother. Even astute purchasers did not suspect the documents because they were so flawless. Knowing that as long as he had the blank forged certificates provided by, he could keep growing the business Gurmley. New cycles of the calendar were already being planned. The others could start over, but Beatrice would have to endure a new 6-month recuperation period. Cold seemed to settle in the bones of everyone who lived on the Higgins property, as well as in the air during the winter of 1858. The nieces moved like robots around the house. Beatrice had made it a habit to spend hours standing in front of windows, staring out at the swamps, as though contemplating whether death in those dark waters would be better. Margaret never made a full recovery. She only left her room when compelled to do so. The young woman had started talking softly to herself, Imelda noticed. Fragments of the lost baby, repeated, incoherent apologies, and frantic attempts to bargain with God for answers that never materialized. As though peering through invisible dimensions to other places, her eyes took on the unsettling appearance of someone who did not fully inhabit the present. Louisa turned into an automaton. Her eyes were vacant, her rebellion had been permanently put out, and she responded to commands mechanically. The young woman, who had arrived with a lot of energy, had lost all willpower. With the daughter that had been ripped from her, Gail continued to have maternal hallucinations in which she prepared imaginary meals for invisible children, held imaginary babies, whispered lullabies to empty air, and moved her lips silently. With practical annoyance, Walter watched his nieces decline, not worry. Pregnant women with psychological instability posed risks to their unborn children, which could lower their market value. He specifically called Dr. Merrick to evaluate the women's mental health in order to find treatments that might stabilize them enough to continue having children. In February 1859, Dr. Merrick examined them all. Even his weakened conscience was troubled by what he witnessed. He recommended less stressful surroundings and seditious tonics, which Walter only agreed with insofar as they were useful to him. Walter restarted the cycle in June 1859 following a 6-month forced recuperation. The first to be called was Beatrice. Because it was now expected, the routine had a grotesque familiarity that made it both more tolerable and more devastating. Gail caused unforeseen issues. Her first traumatic birth had left her body inadequately recovered. She experienced internal bleeding when Walter made her attend sessions in July, necessitating Dr. Merrick. Walter was told by the doctor that she was unlikely to be able to carry another pregnancy to term without facing a serious risk of death. Her body had been destroyed by demands that were beyond human capacity, turning her into a depreciated asset. Margaret's ongoing mental health issues prevented her from participating in the cycle. Instead of seeing her as a useful asset, Walter saw her as a problem to be solved. John started talking to Aldera in the slave quarters every night. He needed to talk to someone who knew that impossible was possible. He carried the burden of both being the victim and the offender. John expressed uncertainty about his ability to continue taking part during these discussions. As she spoke, Alda's hands were working, sewing scraps of cloth together to create movement that covered up the tension in her words, and she listened without passing judgment. She informed him in a whisper that there were alternative ways to resist, that some of the oldest slaves were aware of plants that could make elderly people ill, and that nature occasionally provided answers that the law did not, would never allow it. No one else could comprehend the agony that two victims were sharing. John mentioned that other slaves were becoming agitated during these discussions. Kendall had mentioned resistance. Lysander had proposed escape attempts, but everyone was aware that such acts would be met with exemplary penalties. Emelda talked about her personal experiences of loss. She explained how her 3 children had been sold away years prior, with her daughter being taken to Louisiana at age 6 and her eldest son being taken to Georgia at age 8. Youngest to an unnamed plantation at the age of 4. Every sale had been like having her heart torn out while she was still alive, as though a piece of her soul traveled with them while they were imprisoned. Alda's mind was replenished by these discussions. Her anger, which she believed had been put out for good, was rekindled when she saw the Higgins daughters being methodically destroyed, and she started thinking of ways to act for the first time in a long time. Beatrice confirmed a second pregnancy in September 1859. Walter was given the news with contentment, preparing for upcoming sales. Gail was compelled to keep going to sessions until she became pregnant in October, even though doctors advised against it. Walter calculated that a healthy baby would still be a significant net profit, even if she passed away during childbirth. Without asking many questions, he had explained to middlemen in Charleston how to sell children whose mothers passed away during childbirth. This second cycle's pregnancies were characterized by more complications. Beatrice's blood pressure became dangerously elevated. Gail, bleeding sporadically, obvious indications that her body was unable to support a new life. Walter was informed by Dr. Merrick that continuing would not be feasible. In response, Walter increased his payments, making it financially impossible to avoid silent complicity. Births started in May 1860. This time, Beatrice gave birth to a boy. She had prepared herself for separation in her mind, but it did not make the pain go away. The boy was brought to the quarters where Molly would raise him until he was old enough to be sold. Gail's. In July, the anticipated medical disaster was labor. For 6 hours, Dr. Merrick tried to save the mother and the child. Although born alive, the baby was born much too soon. Gail barely made it through. losing a significant amount of blood and developing irreversible internal damage. There was no way she could have any more kids, and even basic activities like walking would result in lifelong chronic pain. She lost the ability to stand for more than an hour, and her pelvis was destroyed. Walter was furious about what he thought. Waste. Now he had two nieces who were practically useless. Gail suffered irreversible physical harm, Margaret from mental instability. Beatrice was the only one still working. Her ability to produce had been severely diminished. For a moment, he thought about selling them as contracted servants, but he concluded that doing so might draw unwanted attention. In the weeks that followed, Walter was confronted with a problem that started to take over his restless nights. It would be less profitable to stick with Beatrice alone than his original model. He thought about purchasing more young enslaved women expressly for forced procreation, but this would require resources he couldn't justify without disclosing their intended use to his neighbors. He also thought about selling the property and moving to a place where no one knew him. However, the risks associated with each choice increased. His own plan had imprisoned him, and this fueled his paranoia, which kept him up in the morning. Unexpected interference started in November of 1860. Uncertain. There were rumors that something odd was happening at the property. There was nothing particular that bothered people, just discomfort. Among his parishioners, Pastor Edmund Kirby overheard some of these rumors. He had always been disturbed by the Higgins daughter's eyes. Now that rumors were providing background, he started to wonder if he ought to look into it further. Kirby paid an unexpected visit in December. He was greeted by Walter with carefully calibrated Southern hospitality that hardly disguised annoyance. The pastor asked the nieces to have a private meeting. Only under his watchful eye did Walter allow it. Kirby saw unsettling details in the young women's responses, which sounded like prepared, meaningless, and appropriate phrases. The obvious marks on Louis's wrists that even long sleeves could not completely hide, the way Margaret shuddered whenever Walter moved, as if his every action were a physical threat. Gail's eyes were fixed on a far-off object as she spoke, seemingly seeing things that didn't exist, her thoughts obviously elsewhere. He attempted to ask more detailed questions about their health, but Walter cut him off politely but firmly, saying the pastor was worn out and needed to take a break. Kirby understood that although he had been fired, a deep seed of suspicion had been sown, roots that would eventually sprout. Following the pastor's departure, Walter called all of the nieces together and gave them a severe warning about what would happen if they revealed anything. He went down the stairs to the cellar and came back with tools, whips, chains, and other items, which they placed on the table in front of them. With a calm and collected voice, he explained in great detail what would happen to each of them as well as the slaves, making his threat in some ways more terrifying than any yelling. For 3 days he kept the tools on exhibit as a silent reminder. There was an unexpected consequence to the trip to Kirby. The pastor told Constable James Ravenel about his nebulous worries. In carrying out his official duties, Ravenel determined he ought to come by himself. The formal inquiry was about to start. On a muggy January morning in 1861, Constable James Ravenel arrived at Higgins' estate. He came to look into what he thought were probably just unfounded rumors, but protocol demanded that the concerns of reputable people like Pastor Kirby be at least briefly investigated. Walter greeted him with hospitality that made mistrust seem impolite, his charm carefully calibrated to the Southern style. Ravenel outlined the hazy rumors he had heard about the young women's poor maintenance. With well-rehearsed outrage, Walter replied and asked the constable to look at anything he wanted. It was a cooperative display that successfully allayed suspicions. It was a speedy inspection. Ravenel observed a well-stocked kitchen and tidy rooms. The nieces were equally unproductive to interview. Beatrice's eyes were fixed on the floor as she answered monotonously. Margaret quivered as she mentioned depression. Louisa was succinct and uninterested. Gail went on talking about unseen entities. Natural nervous collapse, Walter explained. Upon inspecting the slave quarters, Ravenel discovered accommodations that were on par with those found on other plantations. The special cabins were not mentioned by any of them. Knowing that enslaved testimony had no legal weight against the word of a white man, John in particular experienced difficulty during interrogation. Silence was the only option that did not make everything worse. Following his examination, Ravenel said he had discovered no proof of wrongdoing. The constable left with a clear conscience. Walter held off on grinning until Ravenel was completely out of sight. The system had operated precisely as intended. Even when accusations were true, white men were protected by the law. However, the visit had an unexpected consequence. They had given the nieces a chance to tell the truth, but they had failed. Beatrice felt corrosive guilt about her cowardice, rationally understanding that exposure at that moment would probably fail due to power dynamics and official prejudice. Imelda observed the entire interaction with an official with growing understanding. Official justice would not come. If anything changed, it would be outside legal channels. The thought was terrifying, but also liberating, opening possibilities that before remained impossible. In the weeks that followed, Imelda began more intentional conversations with Beatrice. She shared knowledge that enslaved women passed among themselves, plants that could induce miscarriages, substances that imitated natural conditions, others that affected the hearts of old men. Beatrice initially recoiled, but Imelda planted seeds patiently, knowing that thoughts need time to germinate. John was also gradually included. Kendall had suggested that an accident involving Walter could be arranged. Joseph mentioned that old men sometimes simply died in their sleep, especially when they consumed certain substances. The three began to form an alliance born of shared desperation. Imelda knew exactly where to obtain arsenic. There was rat poison in a tin kept in the storage room near the kitchen. Common poison against rats that no one would question disappearing. The dose would be small enough not to cause obvious immediate symptoms, but cumulatively lethal over 5 to 6 weeks. It would be added gradually to the evening tea Walter drank religiously for his joint pain, a habit so established that he drank it without thinking, his attention often fixed on documents or calculations. John would need simply to maintain vigilance, while Alda added small quantities of white powder, ensuring no one else saw it. Kendall would exploit any distraction to alert them about unexpected visitors. In March of 1861, national tensions over slavery were increasing. South Carolina had voted to secede in December. Fort Sumter would be bombarded in April. Walter followed developments with interest because political instability meant opportunities for those willing to exploit chaos. It also meant that investigations of individual properties would become even more lax. Beatrice began suggesting that she had accepted her fate and was prepared to cooperate more fully. She presented this as religious resignation. Walter, encouraged by what he interpreted as complete domestication, relaxed his vigilance slightly. In May of 1861, the plan took its final form. Imelda would initiate gradual poisoning of Walter. Small doses added to his evening tea. Symptoms would imitate natural kidney disease, something common in men his age. It would be slow enough not to raise. Immediate suspicions, but inexorable. 5 to 6 weeks at most. Beatrice would maintain the appearance of complete cooperation. While Walter focused on her as a productive asset, He paid less attention to other vulnerabilities. John and Kendall maintained discreet vigilance over visitors and patrols. They needed to warn if authority approached unexpectedly. The network of slaves on the property became a system of silent communication. Signals developed over years of necessity. Margaret remained mostly confined, her instability serving a purpose. Her testimony would be dismissed as delusion. Gail, during rare moments of clarity, whispered support to her sisters, recognizing that something was being planned, even though her mind could not completely process it. Walter Higgins died in the afternoon of July 28, 1861, at 73 years of age. Dr. Merrick was present, having been summoned when it became clear the patient was in the final stages of multiple organ failure. The doctor worked to administer morphine. Death came gradually, each organ shutting down in succession, each one failing with the precision of a biological clock that respects neither criminals nor saints. Imelda was present, having cared for Walter during his final weeks with professional efficiency that revealed nothing of her internal satisfaction. She brought food he could barely eat, changed sheets when sweat drenched them, maintained an expression of appropriate concern while her heart remained frozen. Beatrice was also there, bearing silent witness. She wanted to see with her own eyes that the torment had truly ended. In his final moments, Walter experienced a brief window of clarity. His eyes found Beatrix, and something in them suggested he understood. His mouth opened as if to speak. Only blood came. Then his eyes closed. Dr. Merrick signed the death certificate listing natural causes, kidney and liver failure due to advanced age and stress of the impending war. There was no autopsy. There was no investigation. Old men died, especially during periods of tension. The funeral was a small affair. Pastor Kirby presided over a ceremony where a reduced number of neighbors presented condolences. All commented on the tragedy of young women who had lost first their parents and now their grandfather. No one mentioned the earlier rumors. In fact, some parishioners who had heard whispers now questioned whether they had been mistaken. Kirby said nothing. His silence the only protest he could manage without destroying himself. Years later, near the end of his ministry, he would confess to another pastor about his suspicions and his failure to act. The shame would haunt him until his death in 1879. Beatrice, Margaret, Louisa, and Gail wore black veils of mourning. None of them wept. The neighbors attributed the lack of tears to shock. John and other enslaved people attended with appropriate expressions. Some struggled with guilt for having participated. Others felt satisfaction at justice served. Many experienced complex mixtures of both. After the funeral, practical matters demanded attention. The property was heavily mortgaged with substantial debts. The will left everything to Thomas, but with Thomas dead, it passed to the nieces. They inherited land, slaves, and debts. Beatrice assumed leadership. Her first decision was to free all the slaves immediately. A radical act in 1861. Imelda, John, Kendall, Joseph all received papers of manumission. The freed people reacted with a mixture of gratitude and terrifying uncertainty. Freedom in the midst of war was a dangerous gift. Beatrice offered small payments from resources that would soon disappear. John decided to leave for the north, planning to join the army. Before departing, he visited Beatrice one last time. They shared a silence heavy with everything that could not be said. Finally, he whispered an apology for failing to protect her. She responded that he had nothing to apologize for. They were all victims of the same predator. They embraced briefly, and he left the next morning with a Union recruitment officer who was organizing colored regiments. Years later, after the war, John would establish himself in Philadelphia, marry, and raise a family. He would never speak about Higgins' estate. He would die in 1901 at 70 years old, carrying the secret in his grave. Imelda decided to remain in Charleston, working as an independent lairess. She established herself in a small house at the city's edges, where she could live without depending on anyone. The two women embraced, sharing the pain of mothers who had lost children. "You were more of a mother to them than many women born free," Beatrice whispered against Imelda's shoulder. Imelda only held tighter, unable to speak. The property was sold in August at a depressed price. After paying debts, a modest amount remained to be divided among the four sisters. Beatrice moved to Charleston, renting a small house in the neighborhood where merchants and craftspeople resided. She worked as a music teacher and seamstress, two respectable professions that allowed her to survive with relative independence. She dedicated herself to attempting to locate the children who had been torn from her. She visited choruses, questioned retired slave traders, asked doctors about families who had acquired small children. She followed fragmentary leads that always ended in dead ends. One trader mentioned a girl sold to New Orleans in 1858. Correct age, appropriate appearance. Beatrice spent months trying to trace the family, discovering that the child had died of yellow fever in 1862, buried in a cemetery where enslaved bodies were not marked. Another line of investigation led to a boy in Cuba, but Gormley's falsified documents had done their work perfectly. There was no trail connecting the child back to her. She spent decades searching until age and health prevented her from continuing. She died in 1889 at 57 years old, still searching for the children she would never find. Margaret never recovered sufficiently for independent life. In 1863, she was institutionalized in an asylum for nervous diseases in Colombia. She spent years wandering hallways, her delusions about invisible babies never diminishing with age. Asylum staff described her as perpetually lost in conversations with people not present, a woman forgotten by everyone except for one sister who occasionally visited her with flowers she did not recognize. She died in 1881 at 45 years old, her death certificate listing progressive insanity as the cause. In her final years, she never uttered a coherent name or recognized any visitor. Louisa moved to Savannah, where she had distant family connections. In 1864, she married a severely wounded war veteran, a man with facial scars that made him invisible socially, who needed a wife to manage his house, and who accepted her firm refusal to speak about her past without pressing questions. The marriage was a practical arrangement, but the two found a kind of companionship based on mutual silences about unprocessed trauma and unspoken recognition that both inhabited the space between the dead while continuing technically to live. She had two children who survived to adulthood. She was an excessively protective mother, rarely allowing her children out of her sight. Her vigilance born from visceral knowledge of how quickly precious people could be torn away. She died in 1903 at 64 years old, carrying her secrets to the end. Her children never fully understanding why their mother trembled during certain times of year. Gail entered a Catholic convent in Baltimore in 1862, seeking refuge in religious structure where her broken faith might perhaps be mended. The delusional maternal hallucinations never completely disappeared, but the nuns were gentle with her afflictions, treating her as a woman struck by grief rather than insane. She found purpose caring for orphaned children for decades, transferring the motherhood that had been torn from her to hundreds of children who needed care. Her hallucinations gradually became less frequent, replaced by real connections with children under her care who called her sister and who filled the void that her lost baby had left. She died in 1912 at 71 years old. surrounded by generations of orphans she had raised who considered her mother. The sold. Children disappeared into the currents of history. Beatrice sought fragments over the years. One child apparently died in infancy in Cuba. Another possibly survived to be freed by the Civil War, living as a free black person in New Orleans without ever knowing his true origins. The rest remained complete mysteries. Gormley's falsified documents disappeared when Beatrice cleaned Walter's office days after his death. She found them in a secret compartment in his desk, birth certificates, completely blank that he had planned to use for future sales. His expanded project eternally interrupted. Beatrice burned them, destroying any possibility of tracing the children through falsified records. In doing so, she inadvertently destroyed any evidence that would have allowed authorities, if they had investigated after the Civil War, to understand exactly how many children had been sold, how many babies had passed through that condemned office. Dr. Merrick developed severe alcoholism. His nightmares about the births at Higgins Estate tormented him for decades until he started drinking to fall asleep. 1 bottle a night turned into 2, and his practice gradually collapsed while his neighbors simply thought he was a weak man. The decline was slow but unrelenting. Within 2 years of leaving the property, his patients started to refuse his services. Within 5 years, he had lost his practice completely. He lived in increasingly filthy conditions. His only solace was the bottle. Neighbors whispered that he had once been a capable physician. Something broke him, and he passed away in 1884 at the age of 52 after falling downstairs while drunk. The alcohol that was supposed to help him fall asleep eventually put him to sleep permanently. After rumors about his failure to step in at Higgins Estate damaged his reputation in Methodist circles, Pastor Kirby was moved to a remote rural parish. Kirby never publicly expressed his suspicions, but whispers followed him, with some parishioners wondering if he had been complicit through silence. Constable Ravenel served during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. His sermons from this time showed increasing preoccupation with moral courage and the sin of complicity through inaction. Kirby himself struggled for the rest of his life with the question, should he have acted differently? Should he have insisted on investigating despite Walter's manipulations? He died in 1878, with his final words reportedly being a prayer for forgiveness. The corrupt clerk Thaddeus Gormley vanished during the chaos of the war, and he died in 1879 with his investigation records buried in archives no one consulted. He questioned his 1861 investigation, convinced he had done his duty appropriately. Years later, after the war, he would occasionally recall his inspection of the property, wondering if he should have looked more carefully, but these moments of doubt were brief, and he always reassured himself that he had done what any reasonable official would have done. When Charleston burned during the Civil War, his office above the tavern was destroyed, destroying records of innumerable documentary crimes he had helped to facilitate. Imelda lived until 1879, working as a laundress in Charleston, running her own business that allowed her to live on her own. She met one of her children, who had been sold away decades earlier, years before she died. The man had been born with her name, lived far away, and was unaware that his mother was still living in the same city. The meeting was an accident. Saw him in a market and recognized something in his demeanor that was hers. He was now about 25 years old, a free man by emancipation, working as a carpenter. The conversation was tentative, full of questions they both feared to ask. He knew he had been sold as a child, but had been given a new name, had built a different life, and could not simply step back in time. They met a few times later, but the closeness of their early years could never be regained. She knew him less than Beatrix's children. They never fully reconciled and died knowing the pain of forced separation. The Higgins estate was sold and resold several times. The house was demolished in 1879, the land was divided, and eventually it was absorbed into Charleston's suburban expansion. No marker indicates that atrocities took place there, and Beatrice kept a diary in which she documented everything that happened not as confession, but as testimony, with each page attempting to preserve the truth before it vanished entirely. Beatrice found the diary. Following their separation in 1861, the four sisters never reunited. Contact was painful and intermittent. Beatrice occasionally visited Margaret at the asylum with flowers her sister did not recognize. Louisa and Gail exchanged letters, and in 1947, while cleaning the property, the great-granddaughter sparked heated family discussions before they decided to keep it private to protect the reputation of living descendants. The document is still in family archives and is only read by a select few who know what their ancestors went through. When Beatrice passed away in 1889, she left her diary with instructions for its preservation, explaining that there were half-siblings lost somewhere in the world who would never be found, and pleading that no one attempt to locate them. The truth about Higgins' estate died in scattered fragments, and each participant carried a piece of the diary. Brief letters that carefully avoided mentioning the past were necessary for psychological survival, as if naming what had happened made it too real to bear. Complete story, but no one had the whole answer. Some secrets were too serious to be revealed. Silence was the last line of defense, not only for survivors but also for descendants who would be stigmatized for having been associated with such atrocities. What is left is evidence of how institutions can routinely fail those who need protection the most, how legal authority, social respectability, and religious morality can coexist with deep evil, and how those who are thought to be helpless can find agency through covert resistance. This is a story about horror that occurs in seemingly respectable homes, about monstrosity wearing a familiar face, about survival when justice fails, about women and enslaved people forced to become their own liberators because no savior would come, about the psychological cost of successful resistance that still leaves permanent scars, and, above all, a reminder that the worst predators are rarely strangers in shadows, but rather figures of authority whom society trains victims to obey. About lives that continued after trauma. John fighting for a country he hoped would improve. Louisa creating stability in a marriage based on shared silence. Gail finding purpose in caring for orphans. Margaret existing in a delusional world but free from ongoing violations. Imelda working as a free woman. Beatrice searching for lost children until her last breath. But these are not happy endings. Trauma does not go away, and damage is not fixed. We witness. We remember. We never allow stories like this to be completely erased. If this unsettling investigation caught your attention, subscribe to Legacy of Fear for more stories exploring the darkest corners of human experience. That is a form of victory against systems designed to erase humanity.